Let's go! I'm a hard man! Woo! Alright. I got felted by the rain outside. I got felted really bad by this rainstorm. Or this thunderstorm. But I'm back now. But yeah, I don't know. I'm so sick of this internet. Dude, I'm sick to death of this internet crap. I tell you, you can only have so much freaking patience with the data plan, but I can't turn the Wi-Fi off because I've already used up all of my data plan. So I can't really do much about that. I'm just looking at the mail. Alright, I don't know where I left off, but I think I was talking about propaganda, so yeah. German propaganda in World War I was garbage. That's all that needs to be said about it. Like, it was just trash. But anyways, the Allied propaganda was a lot better, and they had far greater outreach compared to what the Germans could do after the blockade and stuff. But yeah, so the Germans were going through a massive hunger blockade, and it triggered a revolution. Let's see here. H.G. Wells was talking about Kaiserism. He was talking about the alleged evil nature of Kaiserism and how bad it was for the world and stuff, and how the Allies were not making war against the German people, but against the backward, retrograde autocracy of the German government. So, and there's also the rape of Belgium and the Belgian atrocities. And you want to pay attention to this because in World War II, Roosevelt and Churchill, they used this exact same propaganda. With Hitlerism, there's not really that much of a difference between the kind of German propaganda that was employed in World War I from World War II. It was just that in World War II, it was much more visceral, much more dehumanizing and anti-totalitarian than in the case of the First World War. But a lot of the stuff that these propaganda ministries and these people that the Allies use against the Germans, they do that again 20 years later with the Nazis. So even before Hitler or the Nazis ever came along on the show, there was already a strong hatred of Germans in America, England, Belgium, and France. Exactly, and Russia too, as it became the Soviet Union, because of what this war did. The Germans did not really employ any kind of real hatred or propaganda in World War I. They did talk about their hatred of the French. There was always a lot of strong anti-French sentiment with the Germans, and then also the new anti-English sentiment, which really, the Germans didn't actually hate the English. But because they were blockading the German ports and starving the Germans, invading and taking away their colonies and shooting and attacking their soldiers in the trenches, and because they were friends and allies with the French... Oh, here comes the stupid freaking train. I'm gonna go in the back. I can't even talk with this train. It blows right over everything I say. So I'm just going to go in the back of the house. Alright, so anyways, I don't know if I'm roboting out or what's going on. I don't know how to fix it. I think it's because I have my IRL set in portrait mode, and this is not a good setup with what I'm doing with this IRL stream, which is really not an IRL stream because I'm not doing anything besides just talking. But anyways, yeah, I mean, the Germans never liked the French. The French and the Germans have a long rivalry. But the Germans didn't really hate the English, but because the English were siding with the French and the Belgians, it generated a wave of anti-British sentiment. And this kind of hate and love affair of the British with the Germans, and love and hate affair of the British with the Germans, would come back out in both of the wars. So you have two countries that are not really that different from each other. English and German are not really that different. If you actually study both languages, German and English and Dutch, and even Dutch and Swedish, it's all Germanic languages. They're both primarily Protestant, with some Catholic minorities, but overwhelmingly Protestant. The culture and the media is a lot alike. A lot of the culture with St. George's Day in Britain and German holidays and stuff like Oktoberfest, love of beer and like a very strong tradition of beer and stuff is very much alike. So I would say that the English and the Germans have quite a lot more in common than they do in terms of difference. But because the British were fighting a war against the Germans, the Germans didn't like them anymore, or at least their government. And the British were being instilled with a strong the British have always been anti-autocratic. And they have a long tradition of democracy, even though Germany had universal male suffrage and a wider franchise for their male voters and participation of the working class than the British did. The British were far more liberal. The liberal establishment, the influence of the Enlightenment, kind of the liberal imperial impulse of Victorian England, and just really the longer history of admittance of the law, submission and acceptance of a compromise of legality, and the judicial system was a lot more fairer in England than it was in Germany. In England, there was habeas corpus, there was judicial review, trial by jury, not always, but with the acceptance of the military, there was trial by jury, and there was a long tradition of legality, voting and franchise acceptance and different parties and different opposition. There is a lot more religious plurality in Britain than there was in Germany. In Germany, there is only the state churches and a very standard and very highly one-sided kind of religious perspective. That's why the folkish movement was so successful in Germany, because it was a backlash against the absolute control that the state churches had in Germany. Like Protestant dissenter groups, Catholics that had a different perspective from the state Catholic churches, Jews and other religious minorities had virtually no rights in Germany. Like, it was impossible to be in a religious dissenter group in Germany. That's why the Hutterites, the Amish, and the Mennonites left Germany in the first place because of that kind of stuff. No trial by jury, no fixed standard constitution, and really just no tradition in the long term of actually having a judiciary system or a constitution in Germany. Now, in the different German states, there was different circumstances of that, but you see what I'm saying. In the eyes of the French and the British and Americans in World War I, Germany was a legalistic anachronism. It was seen as a retrograde medieval society that still believed in honor and tradition and kind of the belief in family and authority. And it was just something that was seen as anathema to democracies. France and America were full democracies. Britain was not a full democracy at this time, but it was in the process of becoming one, along with the Commonwealth countries, but it was still quite a limited franchise. So that was interesting. Also, Britain was a monarchy as well, and the monarchy was German, which is very perplexing. In fact, the British king changed the name of the ruling house in Britain from Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha to Windsor, which is still the current royal dynasty in Britain today. And they've really, for like well over 300 years, the British monarchy has been just at loggerheads cooperating with the mercantile orders. The British monarchy has been favoring cooperation with the mercantile orders since even before Henry VIII, really since the 13th century, but especially with Henry VIII. Henry VIII was felted in his fat ass by the mercantile orders. And by 1750, 1730, 1740 or whatever, Britain was pretty much controlled by Freemasonry. In 1801, the Scottish and the York Rite, well, by 1804, the Scottish and York Rite had united and become one. And then from then on, Britain was effectively the world leader of Freemasonry. Also, after 1815, Rothschild. The Rothschilds had effective control of the monetary system of Britain. Not 100%, but at least in the private sector, the Rothschilds effectively had England under their control, at least by the 1820s. So, even though in the 19th century, Great Britain had all of these colonies and was leading Europe and the West in terms of expanding Christendom and white supremacy, their finance was controlled by the Rothschilds, at least in the private sector. Public sector was controlled by mercantile guilds and by Freemasons. But regardless, for one thing, Russia pulled out of World War I because of the revolution. The revolution turned Russia into effectively a communist state. And so here we have the direct origins of the Cold War. And then, like I said before, Bulgaria, the Ottomans, Austro-Hungary, and Germany collapsed. World War I is known as the deathbed of the empires. At least the really, truly old empires. They were wiped out. They're gone. Now, I do agree that it is true that the Germans did commit atrocities. But these atrocities were highly exaggerated. And the French also committed atrocities against the Germans. Again, there is this intra-European hatred between different nationalities. And so, yes, the Germans did commit bad atrocities against the Belgians and the French and the Russians. I will not deny that. So, with America got into World War I late, but America said that it would be a source of democracy. It will be the defending shield of civilization and democracy. And the addition of American troops in the Meuse-Argonne offensive and just the overwhelming force of the Allied technology and the Germans lacking resources and manpower to continue the war, they had to surrender. So Germany got felted. The Kaiser turned out not to be such a strong man after all, but just a puppet. Like, it's known as the Shadow Kaiser government after all. So the Kaiser Wilhelm II got felted, and he ran to the Netherlands, screaming and bitching and moaning with a dildo up his ass as he went. And all these princes and dukes and stuff abdicated, and there was almost a sort of a Menshevik revolution in Germany, which is a bit different from the Bolshevik revolution in Russia, but it's very similar. So Germany actually had a civil war between the Spartacist League, which was kind of a Menshevik anarchist movement, and also the Freikorps and what was left of the Reich Army, which were basically, I guess you could say, monarchists, but just really overall nationalists and patriots. And they won, but the Weimar Republic was kind of weak and corrupt. And from the beginning, the Weimar Republic was actually very corrupt. And it was taken to bribes and stuff. Okay, and this is the government that signed the Treaty of Versailles with the Allies. Okay. Now, the British and the Americans, they had to step in and stop the French from taking a bunch of land from Germany. Like, the French wanted to take all of the Rhineland from Germany. And, like, the other Allies had to step in and stop that. So Germany was effectively weak, and it was made to pay a very high indemnity. A very high priced indemnity. And it didn't really do anything to help to preserve what you could say was the peace in Europe. And it actually helped to set the tone for another war. And, like Eugene Weber says, the Second 30 Years' War from 1914 to 1945 was an intra-European war that had globalist proportions. Germany was, for now, no longer a great power. It was still pretty relatively strong economically and industrially, and it still led the world in science, but it had been effectively isolated from the global community as an enemy nation or an enemy state. And this type of World War I vilification would have drastic consequences for World War II and for the 1930s, and how the former Western Allies would look at Hitler and the Third Reich in the 30s, and in regards to German rearmament. So, like I said last time about the occult influence, or the influence of Spiritism, and the influence of the Thule Society and all of this other stuff, that had quite an influence on the NAP, which was founded in Bavaria and was later renamed the NSDAP. Hitler did not create the NSDAP, but he joined it and assumed leadership, and he pretty soon rose in the ranks. So Hitler and the National Socialist Party will have very important consequences in terms of rearming Germany and fighting a new war, or at least a new phase of the very same war that started in 1914. So what really are the geopolitical consequences of World War I? Well, in regards to the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, it effectively created very artificial Arab states that have virtually no strength to fight against the State of Israel or against the British Mandate, and then later the State of Israel. It helped to create the State of Israel with the British Zionist Mandate of Palestine, and that was effectively in 1916 the beginning of mass Jewish settlement or resettlement of Palestine for the first time since at least the Islamic period, the early Islamic period for Jews. So it is effectively the rebirth, in part, of Israel. Turkey becomes a artificially weakened state. Turkey is still a relatively strong country. The Turks have always been pretty battle-hardened and military savvy relative for the Middle East, but in terms of like the decaying, dying Ottoman Empire, they were actually a pretty stable force on the Middle East. And what replaced the Ottomans, who were actually undergoing a scientific revolution and modernization at the turn of the century, were all of these visceral, backward Islamist countries. They were very easily taken into Wahhabism, communism, Arab nationalism, socialism, Sufism, and just all of this other stuff. And with Arab nationalism and the division of the Middle East, it's pretty much led to what we have now with terrorism. Bulgaria would, of course, fight on the side of the Axis in World War II against Greece and Yugoslavia. You have the Yugoslavs who collapsed twice. 1941 with the April War, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia falls apart and there's a mass genocide and religious war, a war of ethnic cleansing and religion and fratricide in World War II in Yugoslavia. And that leads to the communist victory of Tito. And then it collapses again in the 1990s with another bout of religious fratricide and ethnic cleansing. More so on the part of the Serbs as opposed to the Croats in World War II. Okay, so Yugoslavia was doomed to fail. Czechoslovakia was another very weak, parceled out state of the Czechs and the Slovaks, and that was destroyed by Germany when it occupied Czechoslovakia. Very easily done. The Czechoslovaks, even if they had been ready and armed to fight for the Sudetenland, they would have lost because the Germans were much more better trained, equipped, and armed than the Czechoslovaks. And then Czechoslovakia collapsed again in the Prague Spring and the Soviet invasion. Like, how in the world were the Czechs going to break out of the Warsaw Pact? They weren't. They got felted by the Soviets. And then they collapsed in the 90s with the Velvet Revolution, like the Slovaks broke away. So Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia were bad states. They fell apart. Austria would just be annexed into Germany. Well, first it became a fascist regime, and then it was annexed into Germany directly. Now, with Hungary, Hungary had a communist revolution, and then a very strong nationalist, almost quasi-fascist revolution, or counter-revolution, and it was a monarchy for the duration of the interwar period, but there was the Iron Cross Party that eventually took over, but Admiral Horthy, who is basically kind of like a Francisco Franco, ruled Hungary until he was replaced by the Iron Cross Party. In the case of Germany, Germany was just under the control of the weak Weimar Republic until the Nazis took over. And I'm not going to get too much into that because I'm going to do that at a later time. So what really is the results of World War I? Well, the positive results is that the Europeans, for the first time in at least 100 years since Napoleon, are actually serious about wanting to build a united front or some type of a united European Union or entity. So there's actually calls for uniting Europe. And then you have people like Kalargi, Count Kalargi, that wants to push the Kalargi plan to turn Europe into a mixed-raced African-Asian continent and kind of replicate the United States in that regard, and India. The British do not really get much out of World War I except a few more colonies, but the British are highly in debt. They're not bankrupt per se, but the Britain has to get off of the gold standard, and Britain goes into an economic slump. And during this time, Wall Street and New York surpass London in population and economic prowess, and America surpasses Britain as the dominant economic and military power of the world. So America finally does exceed Britain in becoming the world's foremost power. And Britain's center or world position is challenged and rivaled by the United States, Japan, the Soviet Union after it's formed, instead of its traditional enemies like Germany and France, and so on and so forth, or Spain. So now Japan is a major power and player on the world stage, equal to Britain and to the United States. And the British Empire, it's still a great empire. I mean, the British Empire reaches its height in 1921. That is the height of the British Empire. So the British win the Great War. They come out as victors, and they have a massive empire, but it's an old empire. It's 400 years old. And there's already something of a race war building up in the British colonies. The United States is a great, prosperous economic power, and it's just going to keep growing and growing throughout the 20th century. The North and the South are finally reconciled. The economic growth and wealth and optimism of Americans is just going to go up. And America's economy is going to go global. So really, after World War I, we effectively have a globalist economy like we have now. Like, the only major exception is communist Russia. But pretty much everywhere else, the world is engaged in capitalism. The defeat of the Central Powers really is effectively the beginning of the Pax Americana. It's only fully realized after World War II, but it's already taking shape at this point. The Japanese are also growing into becoming a major power and a major player on the world stage, and so is the Soviet Union. Tsarist Russia is gone. It's been replaced by Soviet Russia. And although they have a civil war, the Red Army is the largest land force in the world. And they're just ready to spread the ideas of communism into the Far East and Europe, Eastern Europe, at any time. Like, there is a literal possibility of a communist revolution worldwide. And that is generally the idea of what the communists want to do with the Comintern. So you have all of these different communist parties that are breaking out in different countries, especially in the colonized world. And with that is the spread of anti-colonialism and race war. You have people like Lothar Stoddard talking about the fall of Western civilization, the resurgence of Islam in the world, and an outright race war. You have the Yellow Peril, which is talking about how Asiatic countries are going to destroy and overthrow white Christian civilization. There is a lot of stuff about Judeo-Bolshevism that is coming out, and fears of the rise of Judeo-Bolshevism and Henry Ford is talking about the international Jew. And there is also there's just a lot of fear and purveyance that happens in the 1920s. There is a lot of race riots in Chicago, in New York, in Los Angeles. There's a lot of race riots and a lot of workers' riots and stuff. And there's a lot of fear that this is being generated by communism. And so there's a big Red Scare that takes place in America and in Britain. But other than that, things kind of come out pretty stable. America goes into World War I relatively late, and it comes out on the winning side. It wins in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and it wins in World War I. Its influence and outreach over Europe and the rest of the world is greatly manifested. America comes out a winner in World War I. And so for the 1920s, America prospers and is very successful and does very well, economically speaking. But there are fears of communism. There's fears about race wars. There's fears about foreign immigrants and aliens and stuff coming to America. And so America closes its borders down until the 60s. Until the middle of the 1960s, America's borders are closed off to foreigners, and there's a very strong backlash against immigration, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe and from the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of strong quotas that are put up. So, overall, the British Empire reaches its apex in 1921. America grows into its first effective age of economic dominance. And really, this is the beginning of globalization as we know it today. So, I hope you enjoyed this. Ghost of Niccolo says, Forge! Let's forge ahead, boys! Let's go! So, what about the interwar period? What about the events of the interwar period with the League of Nations and with the rise of the Nazis? And what about all of that? Well, I'll do that at another time. So I wanted to do only one main stream about the geopolitics of World War I. And to tell you the truth, I might come back and revisit this topic again in the future, but I'm done for now. So I will now take questions from chat. If there are any questions at all in the chat, I will try to answer them as best as I can. But yeah. Now, how does this play into the worldview of Adolf Hitler? Or how does this play into Hitler's worldview? Well, Hitler was a soldier in World War I. He fought on the Western Front in the Bavarian Royal Army. And his experiences and his patriotism and love of Germany certainly had a very driving influence in how he formed the Nazi Party, how he did the beer hall punch, and how he wrote Mein Kampf, and, how he eventually became the dictator of Germany, or the Fuhrer, and how, his thirst for revenge against the hated French and his hatred and really his extreme hatred of Judeo-communism, as he called it, Judeo-Bolshevism, would have an important influence in the Second World War with the Axis powers. But you see, America is not worried about Europe or Asia. Like, America's not having its eyes on Japan or Germany. It's looking inward. America is going through isolationism. And it's effectively turning inward. And it's trying to build itself up. In 1930, America is a country that is going through the Great Depression. It is a country that went through the Civil War with the victory of the Union and all of these inventions and advancements and rise of the city landscape and the closing of the frontier. This is the kind of America that is going through the Great Depression. The America that loves the Western, that is looking back at the frontier and wants to live through the greatness of the frontier age. In Great Britain, the British are looking back at the Spanish Armada, at the expansion and growth of British mercantilism when Britain was expanding overseas to different continents, and it was colonizing and advancing and growing and spreading its commerce to the four corners of the world, when they were fighting slavers, when they were, all that other stuff, That's what the British are looking back at, was the golden age of their empire. And so this is the context of the interwar period. Likewise, the Germans are trying to look back to some sort of a golden age, some kind of a esoteric Atlantean golden age where the German people were instinctively united in a tribal sense. They were racially pure, and they were tribally pantheist and strong. And the Germans in the National Socialist era, between the wars, are trying to go back before the corruption of the bourgeoisie and the Jews, and they're trying to look back at a pre-Semitic, pre-bourgeoisie kind of sort of glorious age in a far distant past where pan-Germanism or pan-Germanicism was the rule of law. And so there's a lot of those ideas that are being fed into National Socialism. Ghost of Niccolo says, no more brother wars. Well, I don't know about that, dude. Europeans are more enticed to go to war with one another than they do against foreign aliens coming onto their continent. The British are really bad at this. And you and I, we talked about that last night in StreamYards, Niccolo, about how the British hates everybody. But really, all Western Europeans are like that. The British are just the worst at it. Well, I think that's it now.